Welcome everyone, you're watching David Arhan. Today's video is on why God is necessary for moral obligation. To put it another way, this video is about the idea that if morality exists, then God is the only necessary precondition for its existence. So I want to make it clear what my argument is not about and then what my argument is actually about, because sometimes people confuse it. It's not about, only Christians can be morally perfect, or that we should be morally perfect, or that we have some claim about knowing everything about morality and being morally perfect. It's not about whether only theists or Christians can be moral. A lot of people confuse these things, right? They think that when we say that God is the only necessary precondition for morality, a lot of people interpret that as, oh, so you're saying only you can be moral and we can't be moral. No, that's actually not what our argument is. If you are moral, it's because our worldview is true, right? If there's morality, it's because our worldview is true, right? That's what we claim. But we don't claim that all Christians in the world are morally perfect. In fact, I will go one step further and argue that if every single Christian, every single theist in the world was morally reprehensible, it will still not do even the slightest damage to the argument that I'm going to be presenting in this video. This is not about Christians being moral or anything like that. It's about the concept of moral obligation, the concept of morality existing and how it exists. And so it's not about whether atheists can be moral at all. In fact, I will say it clearly, I think atheists can be moral, right? And I will explain why that's the case in my argument. What this argument is about, it's about moral obligation exists if and only if God exists as a moral lawgiver. That's basically what the argument is. So I want to kind of explain a very key distinction. You can think of this as the is-ought distinction, or the descriptive and the prescriptive distinction. You can think of it in many different ways. So there's a distinction between moral descriptiveness or moral ises and moral oughts or moral prescriptivenesses. So this is kind of, I'm going to be explaining why in this world atheists can, for example, be moral. So for example, with an atheist, you can agree that murder is evil, right? A Christian and atheist can come together and say, yeah, we believe that murder is immoral, that murder shouldn't happen, right? This is bad, right? But what we're arguing is that the Christian can also say that murder ought not to be done, right? You should not murder, you ought not to murder. Whereas a atheist can say the words, but it doesn't really have any meaning, right? When an atheist prescribes that this should be done or this should not be done, they are in fact lacking a justification for that in their worldview. So that's basically what our argument is. So this prescriptiveness is what moral obligation is, and I will be making use of Anscombe's modern moral philosophy paper, where she gets into this. It's quite a short paper. She gets into the key idea. She basically essentially makes the same argument that I will be presenting. I'm presenting it in a different light, but her basic thesis is that if there is moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver, and the only way you can explain this moral lawgiver is God, right? This moral lawgiver is God, and that's why we have moral laws, and that's why we have prescriptions. That's why you have moral obligations, right? It's because God exists as a moral lawgiver. And a key point to consider is that a moral lawgiver cannot be judged unless they are judged by another lawgiver or by their own law. This is also something that we must bear in mind when we look at the different possible views. Now, I don't claim this is an exhaustive list. I will admit that I couldn't really think of a fourth or fifth possibility when it comes to possible views about moral obligation existing, right? So there's three possible views that I will be looking at today. I will be interested if someone can come up with a fourth or fifth view. These are umbrella views too, by the way, right? So, human convention views, there's various different kinds of views. So even with the first view that I will be defending, moral obligation is sourced in God, there's very different forms of it, right? So one is divine command theory, which I don't subscribe to. I don't subscribe to divine command theory. I think divine command theory is foolish. But that's one way of thinking about it. There's another way of thinking about it. There's various different ways of thinking about all of these views. These are kind of umbrella views, right? So number one, moral obligation is sourced in God, right? That's what we're going to be defending. And then number two, moral obligation is a human convention. So this is quite a popular view, right? Morality, that's just things, it's just something humans made up, right? And number three, moral obligation is based on rationality, on rational principles, right? On logical principles. You can think of it in those ways too. So I will be basically looking at those two other views and explaining why they're not possible. So let's look at the human convention view first. So again, I would like to reiterate, a lawgiver cannot be judged unless they're judged by another lawgiver or by their own law, right? So keep that in mind. This is going to be pretty important when we consider this view. So if moral obligation, if moral obligation is based on human convention, then first of all, it's relative to what each human being thinks, right? So there's a challenge of describing whether it is objective or not, like making a case for it. But let's for the sake of the argument, say, okay, maybe you can reach to an objective certainty in some senses, right? Which I don't think you can. But even if you admit that, you still have to admit that it is at the same time dependent on human minds, right? So the human convention view obviously will say that morality is dependent on human minds. And so there's a problem of moral judgment. How do we judge what is moral and what is not? So you might say each individual is a moral lawgiver, but you can't then judge that individual by your own laws, right? They have their own moral laws. They give certain moral laws by themselves. And, when you make your own moral judgments against them, that's just your judgment, right? But their judgment might be that, well, I'm right? Like if someone has their own laws, they give their own laws and they apply them, then they can just do absolutely morally reprehensible things, but then say, well, I'm doing what is moral, because that's what I decided, right, as a moral lawgiver. So this is obviously quite a problematic view. The most popular form of this is that society, right? Society is a moral lawgiver, right? So we have societal norms, right? Humans come together, right? They shake hands, they make agreements, and, moral obligation arises as a result of this. Now, we must consider that moral obligation isn't. So some people might say, oh, we made up morality in order to, advance as a species. That's not moral obligation, right? Because you can kind of think of moral obligation as a categorical imperative, which will be that, you ought to do this without any qualifications, right? So for example, you ought not to murder, no qualifications. It's not, you ought not to murder because it will psychologically damage you, for example. That's not moral obligation. That's a hypothetical imperative, which is basically saying that you should not be doing this in order not to get this result, right? So that's a completely different thing. So some people might think of this way. That's not moral obligation. You're not, at that point, you're not defending moral obligation. You're defending something different, right? And if you read Anscombe's essay, you will get this point much stronger than my explanation of it. But when we get back to this point, society is the moral lawgiver, then we can't judge societies, right? There's a problem of judging societies. There must be something above the society, and usually you can't really find it. You can kind of say everyone else, which I will be looking at that, the world as a whole or something like that, or humanity as a whole, which is a very vague, abstract concept. But you can't really judge societies. You can't really judge their past, right? What they've done in the past, because you weren't part of that, right? You can't give laws to the past, right? Only people in the past can. So you can't even judge people in the past. You can't judge other societies in the present. So slave owning societies will be equal to just societies, because the slave owning society has their own moral norms, and that's just the way they do things. Or you can kind of say, the humanity as a whole, or everyone is a moral lawgiver, or the universe, or something like that, like the UN. But this is actually the same as in each individual is a moral lawgiver point. And it's also pretty evident that not everyone has the same moral views, right? So everyone collectively, gives some kind of moral laws, and it comes out about as human rights. So that's kind of the myth of today, if you think about it. But there's no really justification of it, right? I mean, that's just a story, that's just a myth. But the reality is, a couple of old men came together and they said this should be human rights and this should not be human rights. That's basically what happened, and it was imposed on everyone else. That's basically what this view realistically occurs. And there's no justification, because it's just a couple of men who had power and imposed that power on everyone else. And people think it just happens to be good for us. But it doesn't really matter if it happens to be good for us or bad for us. It's something that lacks justification, right? It's just your own personal opinion. It's not real moral obligation. So the main problem, again, is that it reduces to each individual becoming a moral lawgiver. We've already seen how wrong that is. I mean, you can't really get any objective morality out of it. The closest you can get is society. But as I explained, even that, you're still going to get various different contradictory moral obligations. And again, there's no reason to, okay, why is a slave-owning society not just as opposed to, a free society or whatever? Why, right? Anytime you're going to be judging that, you're going to go above and beyond the society. What is that principle, right? Everyone, the universe, the earth, some abstract notion of humanity, none of these views work. So this, you can scratch out the second view, the human convention view. So let's look at the rational basis of moral obligation. So this will mean that moral obligation is based on things that are independent from human minds, right? So even though rationality, the human minds are rational, rationality itself is not dependent on the human mind. Maybe you might argue that, but then you get to the second view. So we're going to be assuming, for the sake of this video, that it's independent from human minds, and it's in the same category as mathematics or the laws of logic. Again, if you're a silly Billy who thinks that laws of logic are made up by human beings, then it's think again. Okay, think again. They're clearly not. And if you think about the laws of logic, even if there were no human beings or any rational agent that existed, laws of logic will still be true. So, for example, if there was not a single rational being, right? So at that time, let's say you have the world, there are trees or whatever, a tree can't be a tree and not a tree at the same time still, right? That's one of the reasons why laws of logic, they're mind independent. They're independent of human minds rather, right? Or, you look at a time, you claim that dinosaurs exist or whatever, or any other part of, the history of the earth, whatever people come up with. And you say the dinosaurs existed at this time, but they also at the same time did not exist, right? That will be really stupid, right? Even if you say, yes, there are no rational agents at that time, so we can say that. No, you can't say that, because it's not dependent on there being rational agents or not. Actually, and this is it's going to be kind of paradoxical, in a sense, it is dependent, but I'll be explaining that right here in this slide. So let's go back to moral obligation. Right? If moral obligation is based on reason, then just like logical laws, it seems to be necessarily true and independent of human minds. That's basically what we've agreed with so far. And one thing we need to think about morality. Okay, let's think about the character of morality. Morality is not something you can do by, it's not something that can really exist with no one to do it, right? Like think of someone saying that, yes, moral obligation exists, but none of us are morally obligated. That doesn't make any sense, right? Right? Like you argue that moral obligation exists, that morality exists, but no one is obligated to do anything. That doesn't seem to make any sense, right? That seems to be very counterintuitive. So it seems that it necessitates moral agents. But here's the kicker. Moral obligation necessarily exists. It's not something that is contingent, right? If it's a rational principle, laws of logic, things like laws of logic, they necessarily exist. And if moral obligation is part of that, then moral obligation also necessarily exists, right? Which means that there must be a moral agent that also necessarily exists. So there must be a necessarily existing, eternal, rational being that's a moral agent. Well, that will be God, right? God really is the only one that fits into this picture. And I will also like to add, this might sound a bit strange because we're kind of saying that, God is morally obligated. But this is why I said in a couple of slides before, right? A lawgiver cannot be judged unless they're judged by another lawgiver or by their own law. So here, God is judged by his own laws, right? So for example, when we speak about, can God do something evil? The answer is no, because it contradicts his own nature, right? If God did something evil, then he will not be God, right? If he said God, can God cease to exist? Then at that stage, That's not God. That's something else. You're talking about something very different. You're not talking about God at that stage. You're talking about a completely different being that can somehow cease to exist or anything like that. So we will actually say, yes, God is in a sense morally obligated, just not in the same sense as we are, right? We are morally obligated by God, because God obligates us to do things, right? So he's external to us, but God is obligated internally, right? According to his own nature, that is. So you can kind of think of it in this way. It's similar to the omnipotence paradox, right? Can God basically, the basic idea of the paradox, can God do something that is contradictory, right? And the answer is no, because omnipotence means being able to actualize all potencies. Things that have no potency cannot be actualized. It's as simple as that. Miracles have potency because they're not logically contradictory, right? I mean, just walking on water. Okay, a human being can't normally walk on water, but it is possible to give some kind of a natural explanation, or when I say natural explanation, I mean God using the laws of nature to his advantage in order to make that happen. You can explain it this way, or the resurrection, right? You can kind of think of it. Okay, maybe the atoms that are separated are coming back again, and that's the resurrection. Or you can kind of say, oh, the human body is without the soul, and that's why it's dead, because it's without activity, and the soul comes back, and the human being comes back to life, and the corruption, that kind of just gets dialed back. God kind of restructures it back to what it originally was, or it's supposed to be. You can kind of use various different natural explanations. Those will be miracles, right? But they're not logically contradictory. But saying that God can do something evil, that is contradictory, because God is goodness himself, right? So that's what we mean. So that scratches out the two views, right? Which means that the only view that really exists here is moral obligation is sourced in God. It's going to be our view, right? The view that I will be defending, that I am defending in this video right now, rather. So we need to kind of, and the justification for the view that I'm defending here is quite simple, right? I mean, it's very simple. Morality exists. It's sourced and caused by God, right? And that's why we know about morality, right? It's revealed to us in a way. It's revealed to us by nature. Some of it is revealed by supernatural revelation. So you can think of it as scripture, tradition, the church, etc., etc. So there's a very simple justification for it, right? And I don't think even atheists probably won't really dare to even challenge this. I mean, it's a very simple view. It's a very basic view. It's a very easy to understand view. So there are a couple of questions that one needs to answer in regards to this question. That's the first question is, what is the justification for moral obligation, right? In the secular paradigm. It is not enough to explain your moral view, but you should ground it as well, right? You can't just say, well, we have a moral theory, right? Like, let's say, we have the moral theory of Kant's categorical imperative, do unto others what you will have done unto you. And that's our moral theory. Okay, so you have a moral theory. It doesn't mean that you've actually proven anything. It's just a claim. It's not something that you've proven. You haven't given a justification. Okay, why should we believe in this moral theory? What gives a grounding to this moral theory? What makes it true? That seems to be very much lacking in views that do not invoke God for morality. How do you determine what is moral and what is not? I mean, you can make up theories. Everyone can make up a theory of their own. Someone can make up a theory that is irrational. Why should we choose between one over the other? Is it because we just like it? Is it because it's useful? Again, if it's useful, then it's not moral obligation, right? That's something that you need to understand as well. If you have it because it happens to be useful, it's not because it's moral. It's because it serves another purpose, like human survival. If you say moral obligation is what serves for human survival, then you don't, again, as I've said, you don't have moral obligation. You have something different, and you call that moral obligation. Incorrectly, improperly, you call it moral obligation. Morality is clearly not something physical. I think everyone can agree with that. It's not something physical. It's abstract, it's conceptual. Then what exactly is it? Is it something we made up? Is it some kind of platonic form that we somehow magically have access to? I mean, if God exists and morality exists, then you can kind of say, okay, it's revealed to us. That's why we know about morality, right? That's how we can have it as a concept in our minds. But if God doesn't exist, then how do you even know about morality if it's something abstract? How do you have that connection with your mind and the abstract realm? You want to call it whatever, platonic realm or whatever you want to call it. There seems to be an epistemic problem there as well. And finally, in the secular paradigm, what happens when you transgress moral obligations? This is a serious question. I mean, a lot of people don't really think about this, but when you talk about moral obligation, it implies that if you don't do this, then you're going to suffer the consequences. And I'm asking, what are the consequences? So, okay, the consequence of murdering someone is, going to jail. All right, that's pretty clear cut. But what about lying? I mean, not all that is morally obligated is going to be penalized in the here and the now. So if you lie to someone, what's the and maybe no one even knows about it, right? So you can't get punished about it, but you're still morally obligated not to lie, independent of whether people know or not, right? I mean, if you do something morally reprehensible and no one knows about it, it's still morally reprehensible. It's still immoral. But what are the consequences, right? I mean, are you supposed to feel bad? Are you just supposed to say, I should not have done that because I've transgressed my moral obligations and I'm going to suffer the consequence of it by, like, what? Exactly. What exactly? Are you going to put yourself in jail? Are you going to smite yourself? Are you going to, beat yourself up? Like, what exactly happens? And if the answer is nothing, then this is not a moral obligation, because again, the term moral obligation implies that there are consequences if you don't act by those obligations. So what exactly are those consequences? In a Christian view, it's very simple. And I'm not even going to invoke hell here. Not even invoking hell here. It just makes you corrupt. It makes you go against your human nature. It makes you go against goodness itself, right? You're acting against goodness itself. And that in itself is its consequence. Maybe that might be kind of a answer to the secular paradigm, but how exactly does it work? Again, in the Christian paradigm, it does work, right? It does work. The consequence does work itself out. But in a secular paradigm, how exactly? I think this is a serious question that needs to be answered. And that's pretty much my argument for why God is necessary for moral obligation. And some of the questions that I think people should be answering if they believe that God is not necessary for moral obligation. Okay, then what is, right? And the irony of kind of the argument that I'm presenting here is that if you're an atheist, you can actually agree with my argument. As an atheist, you can just pretty comfortably say, I don't believe in moral obligation. I agree God is necessary for moral obligation. I just don't believe in moral obligation. But of course, most people won't really say something like that. Again, most people, some will. But that's pretty much all I have for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see all of you in the next video, perhaps stream, hopefully very soon. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. Take care.